All right, well, welcome everybody. It is Monday, but the big news is we're here today to continue our discussion about Mirror Pond Fish Passage. And this is a meeting of the Mirror Pond Fish Passage Advisory Committee. So I'm Vernita Edgar, and I am here to sort of talk through this today. As a reminder, our committee is, and for the public attending, their committee's purpose and charge is really to make a recommendation on a preferred fish passage option. And we've been doing a lot of work on this. So we're staying very narrowly focused on the preferred fish passage option. And there are some things that are beyond the scope of our decision, our recommendation as we move forward. And we've talked through some of those things, the funding in the future, access, a number of different issues. So we are staying really focused on this. And over a chunk of time, we've gone through a lot of different pieces of work, field trips to the site and other examples of fish passage. And we've developed a discussion tool that we'll be filling in today. The discussion tool doesn't make the decision for us. It helps us as we talk about the different fish passage options that we're looking at. The main point of this discussion tool is to help us take a look at the trade-offs that are inherently associated with each of the different alternatives to fish passage. Turns out there's no fish passage alternative that just is going to get like flying colors on every value we care about. And so this tool helps us take a look at what each option is really good at and where it's challenged, so that when we go to make a recommendation, we're really clear about why we're choosing that particular recommendation and the pros and cons that come with it. We have spent some time also soliciting input from the public in a variety of different forms, surveys, and we had a public meeting, and that information has been integrated into our conversation. We've taken a look at some of those items, and I'm sure it will be a point of discussion at different points today as well. But today our focus is to, number one, complete filling in the discussion tool. There's a few more variables we really want to make sure that we've got filled in. And then we want to spend a little bit of time. I'd like to just see where everybody's thinking is at with regard to what we see, questions we have, and where each of you are at regarding your preference. And so when we come back together on Friday to make the recommendation, that we have a sense of where we're at today and why, and then we can kind of spend some time individually reflecting on that or having conversations as needed, and then come together on Friday to review and ideally make a recommendation. And we have, there were some questions about like how this would work. And I know that some of you are advisory in capacity, providing your input. And I know, Dirk, that would be you. And then we have two individuals from Pacific Power, and, so ultimately they're working together. But like Dirk, we invite you to share your input and your feedback so that the committee can hear from you about that and take that into consideration. And then ultimately, when we get down to the consensus portion of this, they'll be taking your input, but you won't actually be part of that consensus circle, just formally speaking. But we do really care about your input, and we want to hear what it is, and that will be important to inform and shape our thinking. Other questions about, any questions about what we're doing today, or suggestions or reminders? Okay, well, we have this discussion tool, and the discussion tool helps us identify what we care about most. And in this discussion tool, as I've mentioned, the idea here is that we fill in this matrix. There are some headers inside of this particular matrix. Those are the foundational items or the foundational objectives we're looking at really making sure we accomplish. And underneath them are different indicators that represent aspects of that objective. So we have, for example, effective fish passage. And then under that, in order to be effective fish passage, we want it to meet state and federal standards for fish passage. The way we have assessed each of these are a 0 or a neutral, and I've given that this funky yellow color, or a plus, which means it exceeds the minimum, and a negative, which means it doesn't do that as well. These are not meant to be comparable across each of these objectives vertically, but comparable horizontally. So we can really compare between these alternatives to see how they, for example, effectively pass all aquatic organisms, so not just fish, but other critters up and downstream, and get a sense of how they compare across here. So we want to finish filling in the form today, knowing that what we care about is effective fish passage, dam safety and hydroelectric operations, public safety and security, the total cost, and social and aesthetic considerations. So what I thought we would do today is to start back up here, taking a look at the public safety and security, which I believe, Scott, you filled in with Pacific Power. And I just want to make sure we're all familiar with this here. I believe we worked through all of this, dam safety and hydroelectric operations. So I want to make sure that we work through these so that everybody is familiar with, and we can talk about what you and Pacific Power discussed. And for clarity purposes, what we've been doing is asking our experts who really understand each of these different metrics very well to fill in these items. So Pacific Power and you, Scott, discussed this and reached an agreement, and we'd like to just hear what you talked about. And again, this is the fish ladder, the Nature Lake Fish Byway, the partial spanning rock ramp, and then the full spanning rock ramp.
Sure. So Vernita, can I share my screen? Is that enabled? Okay.
Let me just make sure that's enabled. I think Cassie will be able to give you the power.
Yes, or you don't have the ability to share your screen?
Oh, no, I've got it. So I'll go ahead and
everyone should. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to do a real quick overview of the alternatives, if that's okay, just to make sure everybody's on track with that. And then we can fill in the table as well, or start to talk about the table a little bit more as well. So with that in mind, I am sharing this. I want to okay, so can everybody see the full screen effect now? Okay, good. So again, most of this is review, or this is all review basically for the committee members. This is alternative one, is the fish ladder. I just wanted to show each of the alternatives. That we did a poster that went out in our public meeting, where we allowed people, or let people, or invited people to come and provide comments and questions. One of the prevalent comments was, hey, why aren't we removing the dam? And that was something that was outside of our scope here in this group, but that was a prevalent comment that we saw. There were other comments that we took into account and discussed that we garnered from the public, which was really helpful. One of the big ones that came back from That meeting and talking about the alternatives was costs. And so we're going to talk about costs a little bit today. And this is alternative 2, the Nature Like Fishway, with some examples. And then alternative 3 is the rock ramp, a partial about halfway across the existing dam. And alternative 4 is a full spanning rock ramp with some examples. This here is on White Creek, just outside of Sisters, a full spanning rock ramp to go up and over the existing dam there, which is in place today, which I believe many of you went out and looked at already. So in looking at this and thinking about the discussion tool, and what I did is just pulled in the one that Bernita was showing everybody, and I colored mine just a little bit different, but Bernita's is the official one. But what I tried to do is I like to really present the contrast, compare and contrast. So when you look at this about like fish passages is kind of the first heading there. This shows if it's a 0, that means it's essentially neutral. It meets the criteria. It's not better than or less than. It's kind of neutral. It meets the criteria that's established. So all of these meet the criteria for fish passage. But then when you start to look at some of the other items, like effectively passes all aquatic organisms, a fish ladder is less than or not as good as the other 3. And the reason for that is it's all concrete walls, basically. And it's tougher for, the smaller organisms, whether it could be a lamprey or some kind of bugs in other organisms, tougher for them to get through a concrete structure than it is for them to get over natural rock, which all the other 3 there have natural rock in them. And so that's an example of why that one was a negative or, an alternative that doesn't necessarily meet the criteria or is great at meeting the criteria. And then you look at some of the others, like monitoring a fish passage at the bottom there. The fish ladder is actually better than the other 3 because it's a very defined structure, and it's able to be fit with various types of monitoring devices a little bit easier than the other 3, the natural systems or the Nature Like Fishway. So that just gives you an example. Then when we get into the other areas like dam safety and hydroelectric operations, I work with Matt and Peter from PacifiCorp to talk about the different alternatives that were presented and how they impact their hydroelectric facilities and dam safety. And what you can see here is that the primarily the fish ladder and the Nature Like Fishway, pretty neutral. They essentially are small in footprint in their to the upstream end of the dam, so they don't cause much of an impact or change in the dam itself. Whereas the partial spanning rock ramp and the full spanning rock ramp are pretty big impacts to the existing timber crib structure. So when PacifiCorp is looking at potential dam maintenance and inspections, those larger structures taking up quite a bit bigger footprint than the first 2, the fish ladder and Nature Like Fishway, they felt that those are pretty negative overall for their ability to perform maintenance inspections and deal with the infrastructure there that they have to for the dam itself. Then when we get into public safety and security, again, the fish ladder is overall a very defined structure. It's very easy to, secure. It's easy to create a situation where it's inaccessible or not as accessible. Whereas when you look at the full span rock ramp and the partial spanning rock ramp, they're very open structures, natural structures that are able to, the public can get into easier than the actual fish ladder. And then the Nature Like Fishway is kind of an in-between. It's kind of a neutral. And an example I would use or give you for this is this example here at Opal Springs. And this is on the Crooked River, where it's a fish ladder. But you can see down here where they're able to put handrails even on this. They covered the fish ladder with a metal screen on top so that you can actually walk on it. And so it's a very safe structure, so to speak, and one that you can easily fence and keep people out of if that were something that were seen as a potential problem. And so that's why this very defined structure, Pacific Corps felt like it was more amenable to protection and public safety than the larger rock ramps, where something like this is going to be very difficult to keep people out from either upstream or downstream if they're coming in the river, and even from the land as well. And so that's where this was arrived at, that the fish ladder was seen as an alternative that meets the criteria and was superior to the other alternatives, whereas the two rock ramps were, they didn't feel like they could meet the criteria for the public safety and dealing with the security. The other part of that too was floodplain routing and the dealing with flow in the river itself. And the partial spanning and full spanning rock ramps add a lot of material, large rock and fill material into the river itself downstream of the dam, and therefore have an impact on the flooding and the floodplain area by importing that much material. Whereas the Nature Like Fishway has a smaller footprint again, and not as big of an impact. And then the fish ladder has an even smaller footprint with essentially no impact whatsoever on the floodplain routing. So it was determined that that one was a superior from that perspective as well. And then finally, on state regulations for meeting dam safety regulations and inspections, etc., the partial spanning rock ramp and full spanning again start to cover up the dam. There's some debate on whether or not OWRD would waive the requirements for dam safety. If the full span was put in there, that would be a question that would have to be answered. Whereas the fish ladder and Nature Like Fishway, again, the footprint is so small and so insignificant compared to the dam that it was deemed that would be kind of a neutral and not a negative, so to speak, for the state regulations. Then moving down the discussion tool, and we wanted to look at also the total costs. And so this is something that in the public meeting that we had, and we're soliciting input from the public. People wanted to know how much are these going to cost. And so we put together a Class 4 opinion of probable cost, which is in accordance with the American Association of Cost Engineers. So they actually come up with and give you recommendations for your high and low probable costs, typically 20 to 30% of whatever you estimate. And then these costs are based on essentially a concept. So we have the concepts of the different projects for the fish ladder, the Nature Like Fishway, and the rock ramps. And we have historical costs because we built pretty much all of these in some fashion in the recent years. So we have actual costs. And so we take that information, we take the quantities, for instance, of material that has to be imported to build the spanning, partial spanning ramp and the full spanning ramp. We actually know how much material that is because we've graded it in. And we can predict based on our past experience from other construction projects, how much that will cost to import. And then same thing for concrete and for, things like general requirements, like what general requirements, when you look at this, are things like insurance. You have to have so much insurance for the project, and you have to have facilities on site for bathrooms, and you have to have job trailers, and you have pumps to dewater. And so that's kind of the general requirements. Then in the constructions, the actual materials and installing the materials and taking out portions of the dam if need be, and rebuilding and things like that. Then the engineering, typically the engineering is some percentage of the construction cost and the general requirements. So that's something that we can estimate as well based on the construction costs. And then a contingency at this point is highly recommended pretty healthy contingency because of we're at the very beginning of this project. We're in the planning stages. We have some idea on quantities, but again, the final requirements and the final details will have to be worked out. So we can put together this, what's called the Class 4 opinion of probable construction costs. And you can see that the fish ladder comes in at around 2 million for all of these items. The Nature Like Fishway is around 1.6 million, and the partial span is around 2.3, and the full span's 3 million. And that primarily is because of all the material that has to be brought into the site. We're in the middle of Bend. It's not easy to import material into the middle of Bend, as you know, with traffic and running hundreds of dump trucks in and out of a site can get quite expensive quite quickly. And so that's one of the reasons why these rock ramps start to edge up very quickly for costs overall. So with that in mind, what we can do is we can actually populate this matrix here. So the fish ladder and the partial spanning at 2 million, a little over 2 million, can start to be our base or kind of our average. And then the Nature Like Fishway seems to be superior from a cost standpoint in that it is the least cost by quite a bit. And then the full span rock ramp is the most expensive by quite a bit. So it would be a negative of overall. Then I have not populated this, and this is something that we can talk about some more, but the ongoing maintenance costs and episodic maintenance costs are there as well. And I don't foresee a big difference in these going across the board. The full span rock ramp has more area, bigger footprint. So typically that increases costs for maintenance and or potential problems that it can have. The fish ladder, once it's in place, concrete structure, the ongoing maintenance primarily is just keeping it clean and functioning. Once it's set up and working, that cost is really just that cleaning for the most part. And even the Nature Like Fishway is very similar on that because it is a smaller footprint. Once it's set up and functioning, a lot of times it's going to be just keeping that upstream end open and cleaned out, and very little ongoing maintenance costs after that. The partial span and the full span rock ramps can be a little bit more cumbersome with again, as you enlarge an area and you have rock material, a natural material, there's more debris that can get captured and plugged up in different areas, locations. So again, it's just there's no significant difference, I believe, across the board on the maintenance costs. They're all going to require some type of an effort regularly to keep it's primarily a floating material out of there for the most part. So that's it on the maintenance costs. Episodic maintenance costs, I don't see a big difference. The fish ladder, some people might argue that are going to be less on an episodic maintenance, and that could be true because it's a concrete, very defined structure that's not moving, whereas the Nature Like rock ramp and full rock ramp are all have more natural material, could require a little bit more adjustments that are maintenance under an episodic type event, but they are pretty robust structures as well. So that's the overall cost component of the project. And then this is kind of putting it all together here when looking down at the 4 alternatives, kind of a summary of the discussion tool version 11 where we're at today. So Bernita, that's an overview as from my perspective, and that's taking into account the input. Peter or Matt, if you guys have additional input or thoughts, please, good time to pass those along for section B and C right now as well.
Yeah, thank you for that overview. That's really helpful, Scott. I appreciate that. I want to make sure that we hear from Peter and Matt about those sections. So basically, just for kind of a refresh, Scott was talking about the dam safety and hydroelectric operations and covering the public safety and security components, because those were key elements that you had been discussing with Pacific Power. And so we want to make sure the whole committee is up to speed on that. And then total cost as well. And we'll come back to talk a little bit more about total cost once we make sure everybody has questions and comments answered about sections B specifically. Let's start with section B. Peter and Matt, did you have anything you wanted to add on this?
Vernita, if you can be, I don't have any comments on section B, what Scott said.
Okay, great. All right, so how about section C? We talked about and got through a chunk of this last time we met, but I just want to ask if there were any clarifying questions around public safety and security. Okay, then let's maybe go down to total cost.
Vernita, Don has his hand up on that.
Okay, I can't see. Okay, Don.
Yeah, my hand is up, more with the cost.
Okay.
So I don't know if we'll make that comment. Wait until the two.
Okay, and then what I might do, Scott, is take down your large screen share and we can just move to total cost. Great, thank you. Don, did you have a comment about or question about total cost?
Yeah, I just want to throw a little concern about the total cost, especially.
You're breaking up just a little bit, Don. Can you
Okay.
move closer to the microphone?
No. Can you hear me now?
It's still a little garbly. I don't know why.
Okay. If you can't hear me, I'll have to redo. Is that okay?
We can make out some of what you're saying, but maybe you could put it in the chat, Don.
Okay.
And I'm just gonna note that there's two of me on this call. I think Jenna, you're signed in as me for some reason. I don't know if you can change your name on your screen. And as Don is typing in his question here, are there any other comments about total cost? Because ultimately, we haven't discussed really ongoing maintenance costs or episodic, other than from what I understood from you, Scott, it would be difficult to tease these apart where there isn't much variability. And so if I think getting clear on that for the committee would probably also be good. So let's see, hold on to that thought and we'll see what Don has said here. Don says he's concerned about the total costs of the ramps. Did you consider the staging area and the cost to rebuild staging area after construction?
Yeah, so the ramps are a pretty significant question on construction and constructability, and there's kind of two ways to go about it. One is you can enter from the downstream end, and that would be a temporary bridge potentially across the tail race of the hydropower facility, and then accessing from that downstream end to try and keep your staging area kind of out of Newport Road basically, and out of the way, so that you don't have so many people. Another option would be to come in through the dentist office there and try to do a temporary access road into there, which is obviously a huge inconvenience and problem for them for multiple reasons. But yeah, that is definitely something that would be a pretty significant issue that has to be dealt with from a constructability standpoint. So I think coming from the downstream ends our best bet, and that's how we priced it, or the initial price.
Don had another comment in the chat. He said,
Yeah.
also we had costs to $6 million for the Whitewater Park.
Yeah.
That cost almost twice this amount 8 years ago. So the cost seems very low to him.
Yeah. I think again, I would say it's primarily just importing material for the most part. But yeah, I would say prices are definitely going higher. And so the concern would be what you're going to see is a bigger differential here than what we have potentially. So with alternative 4 and even 3 going higher, likely, just based on the amount of material that has to get brought in.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think I see Dirk's hand up. Don, your hand is still up. Did you have more to follow on that? Dirk, why don't you go ahead?
I don't know if this is the appropriate time to bring this up, but I know from a funding perspective that if we've got the right project, the funders will fund it, whether it's high or low. So it's definitely a factor to consider, but I know funding entities would much rather fund something that's going to be successful over the long term, even though it might be more expensive than a cheaper alternative that may have some questionable longevity.
Thank you for that, Dirk. I know that was something that Scott mentioned up front as well, was that sometimes when you get the price tag on here, it's easy to forget that there are funding mechanisms out there. And so thank you for bringing that up. Jerry, I see your hand up.
Yeah, quick question for Scott, kind of related to the total cost and the safety and security. Did you assume kind of the grading and handrail type of covering like that you've shown at Opal Springs, or more of an open fish ladder concept?
Yeah, we actually had at least on this initial fish ladder, we had a screening grate on top of it.
Okay, great.
Yep.
And I see Don's comment in the chat here following up on the cost. Scott,
Yep.
It's more than the material. If the river has to be diverted, it could cost substantially more.
Yep.
So, okay, so what we see here is total cost. And do you feel like the 0 for the partial spanning rock ramp still stands after the discussion, Scott? Or do you feel like that's any different potentially?
I think it could move more towards the negative, but for now, I think what you're going to see across the board on any cost right now is they're proportionally all going to go up, or that's just kind of where we're at today with construction materials and construction in general, that things are going to continue to go up, and that's what we're seeing right now on projects around the state. So
Okay, thank you. Chris.
Yeah, Scott, that was actually going to be one of my questions. Like, what kind of across the board would you say, these costs are kind of relative to each other, even if overall costs were to go up? Is it in general, the rock ramps are going to cost more than the other 2 options? And I think I'm hearing yes.
Yeah.
And then on all 4 options, were you kind of thinking of that downstream entrance, and that's where materials would be staged and brought in? You weren't thinking like a fish ladder or Nature Lake Fishway could be built from Newport. You were thinking everything would come from across the river downstream, right? Or maybe not into that level of detail.
Yeah, I don't think we're at that level of detail yet, but we're looking at kind of the gross material amount and the type of structure that's being built, and then putting numbers to that. And then there was kind of some large lump sums in there for access, from Newport Road and or like Don was talking about, staging areas and creating staging areas, restoration of those areas. So, there's some pretty big assumptions in there, but I think what the importance here is more about the relative cost, so that, these aren't going to be the costs of these projects. But these are, from a relative standpoint, probably adequate to make an assessment.
Okay, thank you. Makes sense.
And I wanted to kind of come back to the ongoing maintenance and episodic maintenance at some point here too, Scott, just to check in on, see if we can dial in on the relative like costs of these as well. But I do see Peter's hand up first. Peter?
Yeah, no, I'm glad we're having a discussion on the capital costs, because that's one thing that we are finding in all of our dam safety related projects is stuff that cost us X amount in 2018 is now 3X of what it was, just because of the craziness of global supply change, labor shortages, material, petroleum, you name it, we're getting hit with it. So I like the discussion, and it's really hard for a consultant to look at what the past unit cost has and then trying to apply it to some scaling factor to get to some crystal ball and what it's going to be like in the future. So I don't envy where Scott is. But given it's natural for folks to get anchored into a number, do you think it's wise that this group put actual numbers into the table? Because if this thing sits on the shelf, we go through the process, it makes a recommendation. It sits on the shelf for 2 or 3 years when funding comes together, and then it finally gets, grant funding or what have you, and the grant funding comes in at 10 million or so, right? Then, folks naturally will likely at that point in time say, you said it was going to cost 2 million in this document, right? And so I always like to bring that up. I'm fine if the group wants to put it in there, but I always get, at this level, I always get real, little leery and gun shy about putting numbers on it, especially when there's concern if the numbers are in the right ballpark. That's it.
Yeah, Peter, and that's been, one of my reluctance to share numbers. It's more of kind of that relative scale, I think, is what is more important to look at for these alternatives when you're looking at it, knowing that the rock ramp is going to be, the full spanning rock ramp is going to be significantly more than any other. I think that might be important. But the actual numbers, I agree 100%. I wouldn't get stuck with and hang my hat on any of that right now.
Yeah, and you're highlighting one of the discussion points that we've had, Peter, so I appreciate you bringing that up. And it was a call from people in the public who really wanted to see some cost numbers, some actual numbers. So Scott did the hard work of pulling some estimates together. And then what we're doing is leaving in the table the relative shading here. And I think, what I heard was that the partial spanning rock ramp may actually be leaning toward a little bit of more expensive as well. We can't really tell here, but ultimately these numbers that are included in Scott's analysis won't be part of our discussion tool. That's just for this meeting today. Ellen, I see your hand up.
Yeah, Scott, you have, I guess, ongoing maintenance costs, but do you see much difference in what I guess I'd call more ongoing operations costs? And the main thing I'm thinking about is a difference in how important either of these or all of these are as far as someone manually adjusting flows to maintain the appropriate flow in the fishway and just kind of normal operations. And I guess the flow is the main thing I'm thinking about. Does someone have to check a gauge, adjust the flow? How frequent and how critical is that for these 4?
Well, I think the fish ladder, the Nature Lake Fishway, those 2 in particular are going to have pretty controlled upstream flow openings. And so they could actually be controlled just by the configuration, how they're designed. And the other thing too that you can potentially incorporate is some automation in a system like this, where automation on whether it be an opening or a gate that can be adjusted remotely based on some variables, whether it's flow in the river or water surface elevation, things like that. So those are totally adjustable. And then the other part of this is that for PacifiCorp generating hydropower, there may be days where they're generating it and days that they're not, that could have an impact on how things operate. So again, having that water surface controlled ability may be important for how these operate, and especially on the larger, the full spanning and the partial spanning, because they'll have to be configured so that they don't take too much water at the low flow condition, and then as water comes up, making sure that it's dispersed properly for hydropower generation and the flow down the channel. So a lot of details in that, Alan, that would have to be worked out, but definitely I think something that we would typical kind of details that we're used to dealing with.
These are great questions. I'm gonna just read Don's comment in the chat here too. Don says he agrees with Peter about relying on cost, but's happy to see the larger contingency. He thinks the full span and likely the partial span will be far greater in price than double the cost of the traditional passage. So going back to cost there.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, Scott, if there's any way to look at the ongoing maintenance costs and episodic costs. I know you were just discussing some of those contingencies. Do we have any sense relatively of the cost of those? I know you had said early on that ongoing maintenance cost for the fish ladder, having somebody going through removing things at the fish ladder in the nature like fish byway because of their smaller size might require more regular person-to-person maintenance than the larger areas of the partial spanning and the full spanning. But on the other hand, with regard to episodic costs, I remember you talking about potential large volumes of water moving and shifting rocks and potentially having to go in with large equipment to move things around. And so it potentially being more expensive for episodic costs for those rock ramp.
Yeah. So when thinking about fish passage, I think anytime that you enlarge a footprint and make it a bigger area, there's more possibilities that can create maintenance. The other thing too, on a fish ladder, for instance, or even the Nature Like Fishway, it's a very small opening at the head at the upstream end, right? And so an individual can almost go in and do maintenance as far as pull weeds out, or pull the algae and floating debris and everything out of there, right? Whereas when you get to a spanning rock ramp and a full spanning ramp, now you have a bigger area, and it may not be as easy to get out there and access something and bring it back, and so you're walking across the dam potentially, or it's just a different procedure potentially than the fish ladder and the Nature Like Fishway, which are very, defined areas that are pretty easy to access and by one person pretty easily. So I think the safety concern may go up and create more, more maintenance costs as you get the bigger footprint and the bigger areas with the rock ramps. But again, I don't think there's an appreciable difference that we could distinguish at this point in our alternatives evaluation that would change one of these. It's not like one of them has a pump, that has to be replaced every 10 years or something like that. They're all in place physical structures that are all going to be subjected to floating debris coming down the river that would likely be the major maintenance cost as far as just having an inspection regularly and cleaning that out. The other part of this too is that this could be something that, we have Trout Unlimited that's very active out here, that's something that they can take on, right? And so for maintenance and have a weekly inspection. And when you're dealing with the smaller scale, the kind of the fish ladder and the Nature Life Fishway, it's easier for them to have a volunteer base that could go out there, 2 people, and take care of it. As you get bigger with the full spanning rock ramp, for instance, now you have a bigger area and maybe 2 people isn't enough to safely do it. Whereas it is in a smaller structure. So again, that the footprint to me is kind of a pretty significant factor in looking at maintenance costs and episodic maintenance costs.
So I may put my version of this back up if you can
Yep.
take yours down for just a minute, Scott. And it's just, I was trying to dial in what we wanted to do with regard to these categories. What I hear you saying is it's hard to tell, that there's some variables we could kind of guess at, but that for the time being, they may not be helpful in distinguishing among these. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I don't think you're gonna see anything that will be a red flag, so to speak, that's gonna change how you look at these alternatives.
So my proposal to the committee is that we just gray them out right now if we don't really have the information we need. And, they will be considerations we have to deal with. There's some we simply won't know, the episodic maintenance cost, ultimately that's a SWAG, right? A scientific wild gas, I believe is what they call it.
Mhm.
So is there any concern if we gray these out for now rather than trying to put some sense of variables between these items? Is this acceptable to people? Okay, I see Chris nodding his head. A few people, okay. I did want to come back up here to the dam safety and hydroelectric operations, because this was something that when I looked at it became, an important point of discussion as well, just so that we're all clear on why these are listed here. And Peter and Matt, if you could just speak to this briefly so that, in addition to Scott's voice on this, we have clarity about this particular part of the discussion tool. Are you there, Peter?
Yes, I'm sorry. Can you say it again, please?
I was just wondering if you could speak to your thinking on this section with the hydro facility operations and cost, so that we can just hear you talk this through as well as Scott.
Oh, sure. So from on section, let me blow that up. It's just hard to see on my small laptop screen. So on the hydro facility operations costs, it came down to footprint and control of the water. And so that's all about, how tightly can you control the water? And when we were talking with Chris, it was fairly well understood we could really dial in the amount of water that's going down the fish ladder and the Nature Life Fishway as compared to the partial spanning rock ramp or the full spanning rock ramp. That's going to be hard to control water. So that's why those two were considered neutral and the full spanning rock ramps were considered less than. On the dam safety maintenance, it was all about, how can we get to the facilities to go ahead and maintain those. Similarly, it was based on the size of the footprint for and the out of the way, off of that left abutment nature of the fish ladder in Nature Life Fishway. There was thought that it could be relatively easy to maintain the rest of the dam rather than the partial spanning or the full spanning rock ramp, where anything that needs to get done to the dam would mean a good triangle of that material would have to get removed. And then when you go ahead and try to remove it, you're going to have to get permits to remove all that material because now you're removing fill that's in the river, and that's going to be a significant impact to the amount of maintenance that was going on. And similarly for dam safety inspections, the nature-like fishway and the fish ladder were thought to be very similar, small footprint, small area of the face of the structure that we could go ahead and manage around versus doing the inspections over the remainder of the timber crib is pretty much not possible with the nature-like fish, with the partial rock ramp or the full spanning rock ramp. And so that's why it was, we looked at, the two smaller ones as pretty much being net neutral, and, the partial span or the full span as being net negative. And so I hope that answers the question, Bernita.
Yes, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And then I think we talked about this last time with public safety and security as well. So I don't think we need to go over that again today. I did want to check in around our social considerations as well and have a discussion with the committee about this. I would say that when we talked about this, these are social and aesthetic considerations. One was the viewscape, and I believe that when we were listening to the public, there was concern by the neighbors that the rock ramps may be aesthetically less than pleasing to neighbors. And Mike, you and I had talked a little bit about that a while ago. Do you remember specifically what those neighbors said? I think you had that at the ready. Are you there, Mike?
There it is. Had to find the unmute. Well, I'm not sure I can say more than in a general way. From the dentist's office, which I happen to be a patient at, they now have a very pleasant view of a riffle. And with the rock ramp, they'll have a view of a rock expanse. And depending on how much bypass reach flows there are, a little bit of flow through the middle of it, which is kind of a negative. And then other neighbors commented, I think, in public input who are a little bit downstream, that they didn't want to look at more structure as opposed to the view they currently have. So I think it comes down to how much flow is in the bypass reach. It's my thought, and I think others have agreed with me, that if there's enough bypass reach flows, the full span rock ramp could be like a river. But if there's only enough flow for a fish passage, you'll have basically a fish passage through a rock field, which is a questionable aesthetic result. That's all.
Thank you for that. Chris.
I just wanted to build on Mike's comment in that our organization has heard from, someone that lives in a building next to the dentist office, and it was I just wanted to support Mike's comment there, that it was a similar comment. They essentially have that downstream portion of the river below the dam that they're looking at, and they see wildlife down there, and the rock ramps would just be a huge stretch of rocky fill that would then be there instead. And so this one property owner, that the opinion was, they preferred the smaller footprint, the fish ladder or nature-like fishway. So I just wanted to build on what Mike had said there and offer some support for that.
So I think we would be looking at coloring these to the negative, as it were. I'm looking for the right color and I'm not quite getting it, so I'm sorry about that. But something like that. So Dirk, could you?
Yeah, I just had a question. Maybe it's aimed more at Scott, but is that the vision that you see the rock ramps looking like, just big rock fields? You wouldn't have vegetation or any other potentially softer components that would make those more durable over the long term with vegetation rooting, or just visually more appealing? Because I just want to make sure that the vision we're describing to people is accurate.
Yeah, I think you're right, that you would definitely have vegetation that could be incorporated into it, even wood and other natural materials that could be placed in the edges and kind of creating more of a, kind of a channel for low flow channel for fish passage, and then able to take on more flow as well. The one kind of big outstanding issue with the full rock ramp, though, and how much you could do there, is the whole floodplain issue, and that, having an impact on those neighbors by not only filling the material to build a rock ramp, but then also if you start vegetating it and infilling it even more, that just really starts to put a lot more stress on the flow going around it and into the neighbors. So that would be ideal, but we wouldn't know until we actually get into the design if we could actually vegetate it up like we would want.
So I guess I don't know how to address this here, given that there might be some nuance. What I've done is color these neutral, the fish ladder and the nature like fishway, and then indicate that in a slightly different color, these have some challenges associated with being able to do the same. So that potentially could be done, but again, there might be some stress or limitations around that. We just don't really know. So how would you like to move forward? Dirk?
I was just going to say, like, I look at large concrete structures in the river as terribly ugly. So I would actually have the opposite opinion. So without maybe taking a survey of the actual landowners and neighbors, showing them what this is kind of a hard one for us to answer, because it's going to be subjective.
This is so true. This is so true. Yeah, so how would the committee like to proceed, given that there is some subjectivity here, and we have heard from the neighbors about their concern about a large rock scree, but we've also heard that there might be some options to address that pending variables we don't have at our disposal right now. Should we gray these out for now because we don't have enough information?
I'm kind of comfortable with where they stand, of just saying, yep, this is going to be subjective, and we, there will be ways to mitigate any kind of perceived, unaesthetically pleasing elements. Besides shiny metal. I mean.
Okay, I'm going to make a note of that. Because I think it's important for those folks who are staring at that all the time to know that's something that we care about, that we're considering, and that it will go to the next stage in the discussion. Any other discussion on that before I just move on? Okay. So we also wanted to make sure there was an alignment with the 2015 community vision. The alternative aligns with the vision to modify the dam to function more like a river while also retaining Muir Pond in its near historic form. Again, this is a little tricky. So do we have any clear thoughts about how these rank in that particular, for that particular criteria?
I'll just jump in again really quickly on this, since this is directly from the resolution. At least from what I've understood from past conversations with Scott, that in this group, the modifying the dam to function more like a river piece, well, originally that was modifying this entire reach to function more like a natural river, which is impossible with the dam there. And so I don't think that that's really realistic, at least for the fish ladder and nature like fishway options. And then retaining Mirror Pond also, like, those are specific aspects of the community vision from 2015, as is Fish Passage. So, you know, Fish Passage is our goal here from the 2015 vision. So I think, you know, unless we were saying, well, the best way to do Fish Passage is take the dam out, that wouldn't align with the 2015 vision. But from my perspective, like, I don't think this is something we need to spend a lot of time ranking on. It's important to keep in mind, but at this point, you know, we're focused on achieving this one aspect of the community vision. So as long as it's not in direct conflict with others. Again, Scott can correct me if I'm wrong, or other members can, but I think unfortunately that modifying the dam so that the river functions in a more natural way, it doesn't sound like any of these options really get us there.
Thank you, Jenna. Nathan.
Completely agree with what Jenna just said. My understanding of the discussions through the years and the original vision, really none of these options modify the dam proper, the dam per se. So I agree that this is important to keep in mind, consistency or inconsistency with that community vision, particularly because we had significant public input in a process there. But I don't know that we're going to be able to grade these 4 options in a way that provides, you know, any more sort of clarity between them in regards to this particular criterion.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, Jenna, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't have it in front of me, but wasn't one of the community vision criteria improve habitat? I recollect that it was, and the large footprint of the rock ramp options would be a negative on the impact of the bypass reach. I don't know if that really is a big enough factor to enter into the ranking, but I think we should at least keep it in mind.
Yeah, I think you're right, Mike. That was one, and I believe that was the more like intended around the contours of the pond itself and along the riverbanks there. And so I think that's hopefully part of what Parks is trying to accomplish right now with the trail improvements along the banks.
Right, but in the ODF&W materials for the 1990s discussion of FERC licensure, they devote quite a bit of attention to the habitat of the bypass reach. And
Okay.
actually measures to improve it. So at that time, ODF&W considered the bypass reach habitat a significant part of what they were hoping to see change at the dam. So
Okay,
we don't want to go backwards on the habitat of
Right.
the bypass reach.
great. Yeah, thanks. That's a good point.
So how would the committee like to move forward? Should we gray this out, or should we make these nominally red? And Nathan, did you have a comment? Oh, your hand was still up, sorry. Yes, Chris.
Sorry, I was on mute. I guess I would support graying them out based on what Nathan and Jenna said, because I think they're right. None of these are modifying the dam. And all of these are retaining Mirror Pond in near historic form, so we can't grade them one way or another.
Any other discussion on that? We can just take this as, okay. So Scott, you have sort of a niftier version of this. Let's see. Oh, just a second. I saw Don weighing in on this. He said the full ramp version is the 2015 version. In that vision, either the dam would have been encompassed or replaced to maintain the historic level of the river. Any fish passage is an improvement and helps the river to function more like a river. Okay. So Scott, I think you had kind of a nicer version of this that all fits on one page for us to look at. And I know we've filled in the bottom portions, but ultimately what we've done is take them and gray them out because they're not necessarily going to help us. Do you mind sharing your screen with that overarching? Are you there, Scott? You might have stepped away.
Yep, I
Okay.
will share my screen with that right now. So you're looking that one right there.
Perfect. That way, if it's all on one page, mine sort of runs onto a couple different pages.
Okay.
There we go. So what I wanted to take a look at here was to look at everything as a whole for the committee, so we can see our relative weightings here. Again, I want to highlight that this doesn't answer our questions for us. It really highlights for us trade-offs between each of these different elements. And so when we started out our process, we said we want to make sure we have effective fish passage. Obviously, if we go through this entire process and we don't accomplish that, we aren't doing our job. So we want to make sure that we have effective fish passage. Each of the criteria under here tell us something about fish passage. The red marks or the red places under the fish ladder are all associated with effectively passing more than fish. So this is like a bonus bump, takes into account future possible scenarios, including stream flows, et cetera, et cetera. So we can look at effective fish passage and have some sense of how we feel about each of these different options and the trade-offs between them. Down here with dam safety and hydroelectric operations, again, we see some trade-offs with the partial and full spanning rock ramp and the fish ladder and the Nature Lake Fish Byway. And then public safety and security, something else we really care about. And then total cost. And so what I'd like you to do just for a moment is take a look at this overarching suite of, criteria, objectives, and what we're setting out to accomplish. And I would love to just get a little bit of a sense of where everybody's at. Here, if you have any questions related to any of these alternatives, and upon reviewing this, get a sense of which of these alternatives is surfacing for you as the number one alternative and why, and what might look like a number two alternative to you and why. And so that's what I'm going to ask you to consider and to be willing to share.
Hey, Bernita, one question on this too is that we've spent quite a bit of time and come up with this. Is there anybody that has like a disagreement with any of these that needs to be updated as well? So right now, they're all populated and we've talked about all of them, but maybe there's some that people, after seeing kind of the whole spectrum here, need to maybe reevaluate.
Yeah, great question. I make these assumptions that we're all on the same page, but it's good to check those assumptions. So yeah, any questions or concerns about or what we're looking at here? I'm not seeing any hands up. But, please, if a question does come up of that kind, don't feel like you missed the moment. We would want to know about that. So when somebody is ready to reflect on your thoughts and to share them, if you could please raise your hand, I would appreciate that. And we'll start with you. Nathan.
If I go first, that means I have the most willingness to be forgiven for. So I've just been jotting down notes as we've been going along. And I want to say that I was open and remain open and totally respect the expertise and perspectives of folks on this Zoom call, and that openness extends to wanting to hear from the public. I understand we do have that opportunity coming up, so I want to emphasize I retain that openness, but just some thoughts on the alternatives, and I'll be quick as I can. And looking at our matrix here, which is, as Bernita has repeatedly told us, not meant to be overly restrictive of exploring the options, but just kind of provide some clarity so that we're not constantly reinventing the wheel and we can make some iterative progress here. The rock ramp alternatives, both partial and full, seem, somewhat less desirable from safety standpoints, operation management, even arguably costs, even though our costs are, a fairly wide range. Plus, with unpredictable river flows, as Mike mentioned a bit ago, it's difficult to imagine, and Scott, I want to be respectful of your expertise here, but fish passage, I can see it being impaired. I can see scenarios with a trickle of water through a field of rock at maybe certain times really low flows. So that's concerning. With the fish ladder alternative and looking at our matrix there, the things that really catch my eye is its lower flexibility and accommodating sort of potential future scenarios, and up and downstream movement potentially of a broader variety of aquatic vertebrates and invertebrates. Plus, honestly, it's the fish ladder is, I know what those look like. Everybody here knows what those look like. They're more of an artifice and less aesthetically pleasing. I'm just going to go ahead and put that out there than something like a natural fishway. I think from a lot of people's perspectives. I don't know, maybe some people find those really beautiful. Anyway, so wrapping up my comments for now anyway, I'm inclined toward the natural fishway. I'm still open and want to hear from others, but given that it's more flexible functionally, possibly, for a greater number of species, and given its greater flexibility in terms of uncertainties around the river and its future, potentially lower costs in both construction and O&M, and then again, finally, its advantages aesthetically. It's less of an artifice. No, just some initial thoughts. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for being willing to step up and go first, Nathan. That's awesome. Matt, I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, I will try not to repeat a lot of what Nathan said, but I do agree with his comments at the end. So you asked for two. Pacific Corp likes the fish ladder or the natural like fishway. Due to the size of the two options, it's not anticipated to negatively impact the water surface during the flood event, which is very important. These are the best options for public safety and security, which is a huge factor here for us. And, they are lower cost, expected to be for capital cost at least. The other two options just do not meet our dam safety requirements. So that's a huge factor for us. So with the partial and the full spanning rock ramp, these two options do bring major concerns regarding the floodplain routing. And I'll kind of leave it at that. That's a huge one for us. So thank you.
And Matt, did you have one that seemed more like the top runner and the second runner?
Yeah, sure. Personally, I'm with Nathan. I think the Nature Like Fishway is gonna look better for the public. But I know Pacific Corp likes them both equally. Peter, do you have a comment? But I would, if you're asking me, I'd say the Nature Like Fishway.
Yeah, I don't have any comment. I think they're both going to function very well. I think by the time you get to actual costing of these, I got a feeling it's going to be, decimal dust in between the two ratings as far as what they would actually cost. Same thing on the long-term operations and maintenance sides for the fish ladder and Nature Like Fishway. So I think it really comes down to, what gives the best bang for the bucks as far as future flexibility and acceptance of the end result by, the public and those that are going to be nearby the facility.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And I'll just add, the existing folks that live around there, obviously that's very important for them, but we also have to keep in mind that there is development coming that's going to affect that. So that's why I was leaning like Nathan with the more aesthetic looking Nature Like.
Thank you, Matt and Peter. Chris, I see you're next. Where'd you
Okay,
go?
yep,
There you
I'm
go.
off mute. Okay, thank you. And I'd say like Nathan, I want to keep an open mind here, and I retain openness to having my mind change. But I think where I'm at is, I currently lean in favor of the Nature Like Fishway. I feel it has effective fish passage. It has an edge over the fish ladder in that it's more natural, and it could provide passage for all species, whereas a fish ladder might not do that. I like that it's a smaller footprint than those rock ramp options. So therefore it's easier to build and it's less cost, as we heard today. Relative to Pacific Corp's concern, they're going to be able to get behind this because it doesn't create an issue with dam maintenance or dam inspection. I know we grade out the aesthetic view, but compared to the fish ladder, I think the Nature Like Fishway is going to look more natural. It's not just going to be concrete and metal. I think when folks have spoke to the floodway, flood routing, but as a organization that puts these types of projects on the ground, the ability to get this permitted, and especially being in an urban environment, I think the Nature Like Fishway or the fish ladder is going to be easier to get that permitted because we're not going to be having that floodplain impact. And then, maybe my biggest point here is, and it's something I've tried to say from the beginning, that we wanted this to be a building block or an improvement. And so I do see this as a building block and improvement because it does, it provides fish passage. But given that there's so many unknowns, like how long Pacific Corp plans to generate power at this site, I have a hard time putting such a huge project in that we couldn't necessarily undo. If someday 20 years from now the dam could be removed and we could build a holistic project across the whole site, if we do a rock ramp, that is a huge investment, and then we might have to undo some of that. Whereas if we do something smaller that creates the fish passage, we can build on that, or we can rework that material someday down the road. But all we know is what we know at this point in time. And so the Nature Like Fishway made sense to me. I guess if I had to pick a second choice, for a lot of those same reasons, I'd probably go to the fish ladder, but I feel much better about the Nature Like Fishway from multiple points of view compared to the fish ladder. And then I just add a few other considerations that I think, if we can get to a recommendation, I think these are other considerations when we get into a design phase. It'd be nice if the Nature Like Fishway could be designed to allow some more flow at certain times. Like maybe there are seasons during the year where Pacific Corp could put some more water, more than 5 or 10% of the river. And if somehow our Nature Like Fishway could accommodate that, You know, maybe it's still, most of the time, it's just putting a certain amount of water like Scott's talked about, but maybe it's constructed that it could support some higher flows that's going to be even more effective for fish passage. I think we've got to be creative on ways to keep, if fish come up this structure, how do we keep them from going back down the through the hydro facility? So I think, you know, that's going to have to be a creative solution that goes with any of these. And then last point is just, you know, we're going to have to be creative also on whatever we build here. You know, the owner's going to have to, you know, if we put public money into this, the owner's going to have to somehow commit to keeping this in place for some certain number of years. And I know we've got all the questions about who will own and maintain this, but that will be something that's a bridge we've got to cross when we get to a next phase, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. That was really helpful. Jenna.
Yeah, thanks. It was very helpful, Chris, that you just covered pretty much all the points that I was going to cover. So I don't have a lot to add. I think similarly to everyone who's spoken already, the Nature Like Fishway is my top pick by far. You know, I was more interested in the 2 rock ramp options previously, but just having to recognize that the reality is with the dam in operation, those 2 just don't look like they are workable options at this time. I did kind of want to confirm quickly with Scott, though, that that there is the potential to, in theory, I know we can't really have any certainty around this, but that the Nature Like Fishway could potentially be incorporated into some future kind of full spanning option if the dam were no longer producing energy, if it weren't in operation as a dam, you know, as a hydro dam. That like, you know, for example, a full span rock ramp could be built onto that. I'm just curious to confirm that is, that I'm not assuming something that's incorrect, that is theoretically possible.
Yeah, I would say it's possible for sure to incorporate that into a larger project in the future for sure. Yep.
Okay, because as Don was saying in his kind of note that, you know, that was the original 2015 vision,
yeah,
but and the dam was potentially going to be decommissioned because of that other priority of keeping Mirror Pond and its, you know, keeping the river level up, which in my mind isn't just about Mirror Pond itself, but just about the physical, that's just the infrastructure and the development that has happened around the river at its current level. It's not really, it's hard to envision just, you know, dynamiting that dam and letting it all, just letting the river go.
Right.
You know, unfortunately, we've constrained it quite a bit with the physical infrastructure that's built around it. So I wanted to confirm that was, you know, that I'm not just thinking of something that.
Yeah, no, I think that's legitimate. And then the other thing too, I think is it's very difficult to predict with certainty at all is if they were to, if PacifiCorp were to hand over the dam, let's say, and move forward with some kind of a decommissioning, you know, just what that would look like in dealing with Mirror Pond, because it's a whole nother process, right? Public process that I just would not even begin to try and predict what the results would be. So I think a lot of that is speculation right now. So I think we're best off dealing with what's, like Chris said, what's there today, and trying to deal with that.
Okay, great. Yeah, so to me, the Nature Like Fishway strikes that best balance of, you know, as Chris said, a building block that could potentially be added on to in the future. Whereas I think, you know, a fish ladder, it's almost scrap metal at that point if the dam is decommissioned and we have to go through that separate process. But at least the Nature Like Fishway has the potential to be built on in the future. So I do want to kind of give a nod to understand the desire for both upstream and downstream passage and just the science behind that, the importance for fish that, you know, I think at this point we're we're on this path of fish passage as it's been defined. But I did want to acknowledge that that's something that, especially with the full spanning rock ramp, my understanding is that in an ideal world that provides the best fish passage, but without guaranteed flows and everything, and with the dam maintenance issues, sounds like that's just not a possibility. So thanks.
Jenna, thank you. And did you have a second that you listed there? I mean, I know.
The fish ladder is a distant second.
Distant second. Great. Thank you. Appreciate that. Mike.
Yeah, everybody's made really excellent comments, so I don't need to repeat all those. I think hearing from PacifiCorp on the rock ramp negatives is very important, because it sounds like that's really almost a major obstacle to proceeding if we wanted to go that route. But I favor the Nature-like Fishway for the reasons given: its functionality, potential adaptability to the future. Scenarios are the main things. I think I look at this as sort of a pathway, and if we say the Nature-like Fishway is our best choice, the next, at a certain point, we're going to be pursuing funding and more detailed engineering and permits and all that. And I think we need to empower whichever agency is pursuing that next step to fall back on the fish ladder if we hit major obstacles to the Nature-like Fishway. So I would say that's my number two. And in my vision is that we move forward with sort of an adaptable approach. If the Nature-like Fishway falls apart for unforeseen problems, we still go ahead with the traditional ladder. But I do favor the Nature-like Fishway for the reasons given. And as Nathan said, we do want to hear from the public as well.
That's really helpful and an excellent point about being able to have something just in case we bump into a barrier. And Mike and Jenna, if you don't mind lowering your hands, so if you have another question, I can make sure I don't think it's a residual hand. Alan.
Sure. For starters, I think all four of these options could be designed and operated to work for fish passage. I think we could point to examples of all of these scenarios out there where they do work. Don't need to repeat everything that's been said multiple times already. The one extra thing that I would add from our experience working with a whole host of both fish screening owner operators and fish barrier owner operators, and this isn't pointing at PacifiCorp at all. This is just all the operators we work with. We generally have more success, working with a concept that's going to work for fish, but also is more broadly supported by the owner operator than trying to get the owner operator to accept and correctly utilize a concept that they weren't necessarily in support of. So knowing that all four of these would work, I'd certainly look at what's going to work also best for and supported by PacifiCorp, which the Nature-like Fishway is on one of those two that seem to be most supported, that I would probably lean towards in this case.
That's great, Alan. Thank you. Let's see if we heard from everyone. Okay. And I know, Dirk, that you're here in an advisory capacity, but is there any extra information you'd like us to consider as we move forward with our discussion?
No, I think there's been some really good points. I guess the only thing that, for me, I'm focused on, this is a fish passage project, so I want to make sure we're picking the solution that is the most effective fish passage solution moving into the future.
This is really excellent. So Scott, if you don't mind taking the item down, I just want to post something really quickly here. And I threw this together while you were talking, and I wanted to hold it up for everybody based on your comments here today. On the right, we have our initial values, the things we said we wanted to accomplish with this process. I know we had also discussed screening, and as a committee, we moved that to a second phase discussion. And so, because that wasn't part of what we were able to address in this scope for a variety of different reasons. But I just wanted to highlight what you said about the Nature Lake Fishway. We're seeing effective fish passage. You said you were interested in ecological enhancement of the river. What I heard you talking about was that there's a small footprint, so there's a potential to remove it, which in some ways gets to this goal at the end, which was to select an option that makes sense regardless of whether or not the dam remains in place. But it's also a way of saying there's a minimal ecological impact in some ways. We said we wanted to have fiduciary responsibility, and to the degree that we're able to do that, we've looked at cost and price point, and we've looked at funding sources. We wanted to say, hey, there's going to be funding sources. We feel like we have funding sources. I heard from Chris that permitting might be easier here for the Nature Lake Fishway than some others, and that can save some costs or time, and sometimes time is money. We said we wanted to make sure that there was public safety, and we've got floodplain routing and some other issues related to public safety. We wanted to make sure that there's public input, and in addition to including public input, which we will get to later in this meeting, we've addressed some concerns we heard from the public regarding aesthetics. Today in our meeting, we brought in the cost estimates that were a specific request from the public so that we could discuss that as a committee. And we've really tried to address the 2015 vision to make sure that we're considering that as we move forward. There was a discussion about public interest and awareness of private interests, like just making sure that if there's a public investment of money, that it is the public that's benefiting as well. And I feel like we've addressed that in our conversations as we've moved forward. And we're taking a look here at, a few other things where we want to make sure the option makes sense regardless of whether or not the dam remains. The Nature Lake Fishway seems to offer more opportunity for that based on the small footprint, the flexibility that Jenna highlighted in her question to Scott. We also see that there's a potential flexibility for more or less flow of water through the Fishway. Potentially there's that. And in addition, we're seeing of all of these, there's also we can say that there's minimal impact to the hydro facility. I just wanted to make sure that we were aware as we looked through things that our initial values of what we wanted to accomplish, to me, and I invite your discussion or feedback on this, it looks like we're lining up to accomplish what we initially discussed. Any questions or additions to this or comments? Did I miss the mark on this, or does this seem right to you? Seeing Nathan with a thumbs up.
Yeah, I wanted to know the ecological enhancement bullet there, that I think they all achieve this by achieving fish passage. However, I think the Nature Lake Fishway has a slight bump over the fish ladder and being able to pass all aquatic organisms. And just the habitat itself that would be created in Nature Lake Fishway is superior to the fish ladder. So, because you can't deny that having something that is nature-like with potential to have vegetation in it, and to have little pools and things that form, that is superior to the metal structure ecologically. So I think it is a greater enhancement, meets that priority.
Great, thank you, Jenna. Peter, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just want to make sure, Scott, in the floodplain routing, typically I think I've seen that as flood flow routing, because we're not going to route the floodplain, we're going to route the flood flows. And so I just want to make sure from a technical perspective, in case this thing is picked up at some time later on, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong. So I think it should be flood flow routing, and it's not expected, the Nature Light Fishway is not expected to have negative impacts to the floodplain.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification, Peter. So I just want to check in around next steps for this. I'm not hearing really any controversy on this. I also know that we were planning on making a final recommendation on Friday. And I'm curious just to see if this group is comfortable moving forward with this as a recommendation today, because it does seem like there's uniform clarity and thinking around this. Or if you would like the time to sit with us until Friday, we do have that time allotted for a discussion and a formalization of the recommendation. How would this group like to proceed?
I'll just jump in and say I am eager to get to a recommendation, but I'd like to hear from the public first. So if we could revisit that question after we have public comment, then I'll be able to answer it definitively. But I'm ready to move this on to the next phase and start the fundraising process and think about how we can put this into action.
Great. Chris?
I was going to say similar, I think we've got time in this meeting allotted at the end here for public comments. We need to hear that. And then I think there may just be value with sitting on this. And if maybe there are some other feelings that are out there, it gives people, the public or this committee members a chance to talk with each other in the coming days. And then we come back on Friday. So I think there's some value in that. My mind can be changed though.
Well, I think that makes sense. And I also feel good about that because it gives us time to sit with a decision we've thought about for a while. And part of a decision, part of any decision is legitimizing the decision, which means that the public is in support of it. Having that time gives time for people to reach out to you, to provide extra feedback. I always feel like the time in these meetings for public input is incredibly valuable and limited. So we will just proceed with our scheduled plan. I wanted to highlight that we're scheduled to meet Friday, April 28th. Thank you for making time in your agendas this week. There were some people who had some questions about why this was taking so long. And I think it's because we're all such busy people. It's hard to find a time where we can all get together. But we carved out the time this week, Monday and Friday, so that we could meet. And we will come prepared to have a final recommendation. My hope is that we will also have a recommendation option number 2. It sounds like we're in alignment to have an option number 1 and potentially that distant option number 2. The only reason for the option number 2 would be if there is some significant barrier to option number 1 that would prevent this from moving forward. And so if you could think between now and Friday, what a trigger point would be to say, hey, we should sort of drop option 1 and move toward option 2 based on this really significant, insurmountable, or delaying barrier so that we can flesh that out. The thing I wouldn't want to happen is that we come up with a recommendation, there's some unforeseen circumstance, and then all of this hard work sits on a shelf for a really long time. Whereas if we have a backup plan, that may not happen. So ideally, there's no problem, and option number 1 proceeds apace, but life sometimes throws us unforeseen curveballs, and I'd like us to be prepared for that. Also, what I would like to highlight is that after we make a recommendation, I'll be reaching out to the city of Bend and Bend Parks and Recreation District to formally submit this recommendation to them. You'll be notified about when that will be. It'll likely be like I'll be joining via Zoom to share that information with them. And each of those bodies will review that recommendation and address it for formal approval. At that time, I will include a list of some additional things that go along with the next phase of this project. That includes things like figuring out operations and management costs, figuring out things like access, figuring out things like, is it possible to get a long-term, meaning like 5 to 15 years is what Dirk was saying, commitment from Pacific Power, which sounds like that is something that would be needed to secure any kind of federal funding, like that kind of an agreement in place. So I'll have a list of those items. If you have things you would like on that list, please bring them to the meeting on Friday so that when we get together, I've got a formal list of what those things are you're adding to it so that I can forward that to the city of Bend and Bend Parks and Recreation District along with our recommendation. The other thing is like this tool that we've created together will be available for discussion to really help all of us communicate with our partners, the public, decision makers about why we selected the recommendation that we've made, why that's what we're doing. So again, it's a tool for us to continue to use to communicate that, gosh, with every decision, we don't get our cake and get to eat it too. We always have to make some tough decisions about trade-offs. So I hope it's a tool that's useful as we continue this communication process. Any other questions before I open it up to some public comment? Okay, great. Let's see. I think Cassie's here to help me out with this. And Cassie, did you have that slide? Great. So you will be on mute when you first join the meeting. If you have a comment, please use the raise hand function by clicking the raise hand icon. And then I'll call on you and you'll have the ability to unmute your microphone. And then you'll be able to speak. We're asking for public comments of 2 minutes or less. So thank you for that. And let's see, do we have anyone interested in public comments? Let's see. I have Allegra V.
And Vernita, would you like me to pull up kind of the 2-minute timer?
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, thank you.
Do that as well. And then Allegra, we only have, Allegra's the only one whose hand is raised right now. So Allegra, I'm giving you the permission to speak and you should be able to share your comment. And then you can just, you'll be able to see kind of where you're at in your 2 minutes in a moment here, but you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. My understanding of putting in fish passage is that to make it effective, you also need fish screening. And I understand that effective fish passage is the most important goal that the committee wants to get to. And so, somewhere in one of your meetings, I think I heard Vernita say that fish screening is just outside of the scope of the committee. And I would like transparency on how this decision came about. Was there a vote of the committee at the beginning that said we're not going to consider fish passage? And if it was not a vote of the committee, who made the decision? If the decision was made by Vernita, what did she base that decision on? Was it on conversations with individuals in the committee or outside of the committee. I just like transparency on how that decision was made. Thank you.
I appreciate that so much, Allegra. And just so you know, I don't really get to make any decisions on this committee. So anyway, would somebody like to address the question about fish screening for Allegra? Or shall I discuss it? So fish screening had to do with screening the turbines, I believe, of the facility. So again, the screening of the turbines at the hydro facility is outside the parameters of fish passage. The concern about screening the turbines has a lot to do with whether or not the fish going up and down the river through potentially the hydro facility would get, I think the term I heard was chowdered as they went back down through fallback. So there is concern, Allegra, around fish going upstream through fish passage and then falling back and potentially having an increased risk of being chopped up in the turbines. However, the fish passage itself is separate from the screening of the turbines. And so, creating fish passage is different than screening turbines, although there is a question about whether adding screening because we're creating fish passage would be something that would be warranted. And I see that Scott unmuted, so maybe Scott can add something to this discussion.
Yeah, Bernita, thanks. So yes, we agree. The screening is another aspect of this project. It's kind of an independent part, though, that we're planning on taking up with the fish passage project. The other part of that too, though, is that the alternatives that were developed, one of the criteria that we utilized was trying to minimize any potential for fallback in fish going into the turbine area. So that's why when you look at the fish ladder, you look at the Nature Like Fishway, they access when they come up, and if they're coming upstream, they're going to access at the upper end of the dam, at the upstream end of the dam.
Can I interrupt here?
Sure.
My question was, I'm sorry, I apologize if I was unclear. My question was, who decided that fish screening is outside of the scope of this committee? Who decided that?
Well, I think what Scott and I have been explaining to you, Allegra, is that in the discussion with the committee, it was recognized that screening is separate from fish passage because the fish passage is a different structure and a different decision than whether or not to screen the turbines. Scott, would you agree with that?
Yeah, it wasn't taken off the table at all. It's just we've been focusing on fish passage at this point, and the screens have always been something that's there that would also be dealt with at a later date.
And the screening, again, that if we go to Pacific Power, it's like screening of their turbines on their facility. So isn't that their decision?
Well, it gets into some additional issues, and one of those issues is how much flow is going towards the turbine, because you have to be able to design the screening options or any kind of fish deterrent system based on the amount of flow that's going in that direction. So that's why that wasn't a question that we were readily available to answer as far as getting answers in the flow data. So we put it on hold so that we could focus on the fish passage first, and then the screening would be a follow-up as well.
So Allegra, the answer to your question is that the committee discussed this and together decided this isn't part of the scope of the fish passage recommendation, which is our charge.
And just to, it looks like Mike has his hand up too, and he might have a technically better answer on this. But I would say what I'm hearing is that none of these options preclude screening. We all recognize that this is an important piece of the project, but until we decided which specific fish passage option we wanted to pursue, that changes the answer on what screening would be required as part of that, or what screen would be appropriate as part of that project. So it's not saying, oh, we're putting that question off until later because we're not going to address, because screening isn't a priority. It's just saying that until this committee came to agreement on a recommendation on what type of fish passage option is going to be the preferred alternative here, you can't really answer the screening question. Is that a good interpretation? I would also say that not only does the screening, it would go on to the Pacific Course facility, but to me, it's potentially their responsibility. That may be outside of, I may be speaking a little out of turn here, but to me, that's, we want to make sure that this facility doesn't result in a fallback, but I think that conversation should be continued with Pacific Corp.
Yeah.
Great, Mike.
This is Mike. Yes, I raised this question about downstream migration and screening several times during the year, and would like to note that the way I read the administrative rules, fish passage by administrative rules means accommodation of both upstream and downstream migration of fish. So we have not dealt with downstream migration, and I was going to wait until Friday to bring this up, but I think part of the MOU between City and Park and Recs is for us to make a recommendation as to a preferred option and further study. And so I think this committee should recommend that downstream migration accommodation with the potential need for screening be flagged as a topic that merits ongoing work group perhaps or study as we proceed with the upstream passage option. But downstream passage and migration is part of, quote, fish passage. So I think the committee should address that in terms of a recommendation for follow-up.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And I appreciate that because screening is definitely something that goes on that list of next step items. And one of the things that we talked about as well was the location of any fish passage structure. And that's one way to address potential fallback as well by the location. And so until we have more information about where things will be located, we won't know as much about that either. I see another hand here from the public. Scott and Allegra, thank you for your question. Obviously, there is a lot of interest in this, so we appreciate that. Scott, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, Scott, I have given you permission to speak and you should be able to make your comment. That's Scott Jansen. Are you there?
Are you there, Scott? I'm not getting anything from Scott. Are you?
No.
I'm going to check the chat. I don't see anything in the Q&A or chat either, but his hand is still up. Scott, we can't hear you. You might need to unmute. If you go down to the lower left-hand corner of your screen, there's a microphone button.
Well, you actually just remuted. You were unmuted. So it may be a microphone issue, but we are not able to hear you.
Perhaps you could put your comment in the Q&A. And I'm not seeing anybody else's hand up here.
Okay.
Okay, I'm so sorry, Scott. If you could please send an email to myself or Nick. We'd love to hear what you have to say. That would be really, really helpful. And I'd like to thank everybody in the public who has attended and shared today. Let's see, oh, Scott said attraction flow to nature like Fishway, ? Trying to raise his hand without success is Sean Pugh. Could we get Sean on briefly, Cassie?
Sure. Just flagging that we're just at about time as well, but let me find Sean. Okay, Sean.
I think
you
we have
should-
1 minute for Sean.
Sean, you should have the ability to make your unmute and make your comment now.
I'm not getting anything from him either. Okay, well, I'm so sorry. I'm going to just put in the Q&A my email address, or please go online and get my email address if you have a question about it. And we would love to get your public comments, so please, please do send those. I don't know why we're having difficulty hearing from you audibly today, but we had a question about fish screening. Who decided that it was a next step process? And Allegra, please reach out if that answer needs more clarification for you. And everybody else, I will look forward to seeing you on Friday. Scott, thank you so much for your work on this today. We really appreciate it. Cassie, thank you for your support. And everybody else, thank you so much for your ongoing diligent efforts. I look forward to seeing you on Friday, and I look forward to what's coming next. So thanks all.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.